Okay, can everyone see the screen, the presentation, screen share?
Yes,
Can you see the screen?
yes, brother.
Okay, great. So let's begin. Today's lecture is marketing strategy. Thank you for joining on this Friday morning. I hope all of you are doing well during this difficult time, and I appreciate everybody's understanding and hard work uh, to continue to learn and participate. So I really appreciate that. And once again, please make sure that you put your name in the chat room as uh, instructed. So today's topic is about marketing strategy. And I wanted to say a few words about marketing in general. If you recall from last week, where we basically did an overview of marketing, I mentioned that this is one of the most important courses you might ever take. Obviously, marketing is very important for business, but it is a critical mindset as well for your personal lives, for your careers, and for many organizations that are not necessarily business. So this includes governments, nonprofits, and so forth. So I'll give you a perfect example. COVID-19, the crisis that we are undergoing now, is not just a medical crisis, and it's not just a economic crisis or a scientific crisis. It is also a marketing crisis. And you might say, well, what does COVID-19 have to do with marketing? But many of these efforts to manage epidemics, to manage behavior, to manage societies, are all related to marketing. So, for example, when the outbreak first came out, there's always the issue of governments and public health authorities on how much do we tell the public and how do we tell the public and what do we tell the public. So the first question, how much, is there's often concern. If we say too much, is it panic? If we say too little, is that not being truthful? And so forth. So these are very important issues, and people have made decisions, good or bad, about this, about how much to tell. And that's a marketing issue, fundamentally. And of course, we're going to talk about marketing ethics and near the end of the course. And of course, truthfulness and transparency are extremely important principles in general in human life, not just in human interactions, not just marketing. But it's not an easy question. So, for example, if you say at the beginning of the epidemic that the fatality rate is 5%, so that you get people worried about it, but you actually don't know if it's 5% because there's a controversy over the numbers and so forth, then is this very open discussion or open marketing, if you will, is that a good thing? So these are not easy questions and not really easy issues. And then the second question is, what do you tell? Uh, and there's been a lot of discussion on different leaders and how they have communicated the virus, how much science they do, how much plain speak, normal speak, how do they appeal to people's reason, to their emotion, uh, uh, what the message is also a open issue. And then the third thing is, how do we say it? Do we do public health briefings? In Korea, we have twice a week public health briefings. I think as a marketing strategy, it's been quite effective. And then, of course, then they started to do translations as well, so they can engage broader population, a broader range of people. So how much you say, what you say, how you say it, these are all important questions, and also related, of course, to marketing strategy. And then in order to deliver that message, we have to get information from the market. As I said, marketing has two sides, getting information from the market and then also influencing the market. So it's not just about getting the word out, which is very important, but ascertaining what is the public's response, doing the testing to see how big the epidemic is, not just to do the medical matters and the public health matters, but also to get information about where the epidemic is coming out and where to focus efforts, where to concentrate the marketing and messaging, marketing communications. So this whole crisis and its successful outcome or not successful outcome, we don't know yet, depends crucially on marketing, not on the margins, but as an essential part of the society's response to this issue. So marketing is very critical. And another example of this, as many of you heard, there are issues with people that don't like vaccines. And in the United States, perhaps in other countries too, we call this the anti-vaxxer movement, where there are people who don't want to be vaccinated, don't want their children to be vaccinated. And we have big issues on the measles outbreak. And then obviously this will also impact with COVID-19 because ultimately the only solution to this crisis is a vaccine. So when that comes out, which is hopefully sooner rather than later, then we have a marketing issue. How do we convince people, sufficient number of people, and we're not talking about a few people, of course, we're talking about 75 to 90% of the population or more getting vaccinated? How is that message going to be sent out in the context of resistance by some people to this, which could make the whole initiative and program fail? And that is a marketing problem and relates to marketing strategy, of course. So getting the vaccine is not just a matter of the science and the production, but most crucially, actually, and I would say almost more crucially, will be the marketing effort. So I remember in 1970, 1976, that's a while ago, in the United States, there was a concern about a swine flu epidemic. And let me actually show this here. I'll try to look for this. I'm going to put it on the screen if you don't mind. Okay, let's try this. Okay, can you see this picture? It's not very clear. Let me try one more. Okay, this is a little bit better. Okay, can you see this picture on the screen? Somebody says yes. Okay, great. So that is President Gerald Ford. President Gerald Ford in 1976. He is the President of the United States. I believe this was the chief, one of the chief doctors, and he's giving him the injection, the vaccine. And he's smiling. The doctor is there. And what's also interesting is President Gerald Ford is wearing a tie, necktie, and it has a symbol. It's hard to see here, but that's the symbol of the United States Marine Corps. And it's showing that he's a former veteran Marine Corps. He's a very strong man, soldier, now, of course, president at that time. And he is showing his weakness but strength also by saying that I'm going to get the vaccine. And this was the public message that went out. Now, that was a very controversial issue, and I'm not going to go into the details of that now, but this is part of the marketing message. And we can talk later as a case study about this marketing of swine flu in 1976 and how it succeeded and failed, and actually some aspects of it failed as in terms of marketing. But this is a very powerful image. Everybody, millions of people saw this, and millions of people received the vaccine. So that's an example of marketing. So I hope I've convinced you a little bit about the central role that marketing plays. Following up on last week's lecture, what is marketing? Today's lecture is focusing on marketing strategy. And once again, I'm actually on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect if you're on LinkedIn, so we can have another platform to connect as well. So what we have done so far, the course is in two parts, as you know. The first part is getting information from the market, and that's understanding the market. And the second part is shaping the market or influencing the market. So if you remember from the last lecture, we had the analogy of the cell, the unit of life, and the cell where living organisms basically fundamentally arise has a membrane, and that membrane separates the outside from the inside. And that membrane can be considered the marketing function of the cell. Not the energy production and not the protein production. There's many other functions, but the marketing function insofar as it serves as an interface between the outside world and the company or the organization, the inside world. And so we need to understand that outside world. That's the first part of the course. And we need to also influence and shape that outside world. And that's the second part of the course. So today we're going to focus on marketing strategy, lecture number 2. So first of all, what is strategy? Why is strategy important? We will discuss some frameworks for strategy. Then we will review in more detail, which we introduced last time, the marketing mix or the 4 Ps of product, promotion, price, and placement. Then we'll discuss the marketing plan, which is the final project for the class, as you know. Just give an introduction to the marketing plan. So what is strategy? Why is strategy important? We'll discuss the thinking of Michael Porter and his key article, What is Strategy, is in the readings. I've uploaded the readings, and I encourage you to read those. And after every lecture, starting next week, we will actually discuss the readings. They will be uploaded on Mondays, and on Friday, At the second half of the lecture period, we will discuss those readings. But the first 2 weeks, please do those readings on your own because we upload it on Friday. So Michael Porter is a famous Harvard Business School professor, and he is considered, in a sense, the founder of business strategy, and we'll talk about some of his ideas today. One of the key things that Michael Porter emphasized is what strategy is not. Then we'll talk about the productivity frontier and how that relates to strategy. We will discuss why is strategy important, and we'll revisit some case studies that will highlight the points that we have discussed. Any questions so far? You can type them in the Zoom chat. I will be looking at that every so often. Any questions? Okay, let's continue. Michael Porter, as I mentioned, Harvard Business School professor. What is strategy? In essence, companies are going to do a strategy or going to engage in a strategy, and marketing will fit into that. Marketing strategy as an aspect of that is competing to be the best and competing, very importantly, to be unique. So copying and following others is not a strategy. And we'll talk about exactly why that is not a strategy. So strategy is about making choices on what an organization will achieve and how it will achieve or deliver that value. And that's the fundamental teaching of Michael Porter. So in terms of marketing, I apologize for the Korean here, but I just want to mention what this means. In Korean, we have two words, chota, which means to be good. It's an adjective. And 좋아하다, which is to like. And this is very interesting because chota is to be good, and 좋아하다, to like, is derived from to be good, is to, in a sense, to make good. And therefore, what is liked is also what is good. And this is a very central concept in marketing, to the effect that if you want to have a good product and a successful product, it has to align with what is actually also liked. And by having it liked, it is also good. So there's actually a very interesting linguistic connection, if you will, in Korean with marketing. The other interesting thing is, as I mentioned, strategy is competing to be unique, or how to be different. Even though, as I mentioned, this linguistic aspect is very connected to marketing, there's a very interesting concept in Korean, this called tillingot. Tillingot means two things, actually. It can imply a different thing, or it can also imply a bad thing. And so this is very interesting in Korean business, is if strategy is competing to be unique or different, which is the fundamental argument of Michael Porter, then there are a sort of a context in which if you are different, it is also bad. So that's a real challenge, is if you go around and you see everybody opens a chicken and beer shop, and that's a strategy to start a business, and every neighborhood has chicken and beer, so they're all copying and doing the same thing. That's not a strategy that's effective for sustainable future, and we'll talk about that. But it's interesting, in culturally speaking, we have kind of a aversion to doing different things. Of course, it's not a Korean thing, it's also kind of human. To be very different implies potentially very bad. But actually, this is very important in strategy, is to actually have an effective strategy, the key aspect is to actually be different. And this is very important concept. So what is strategy? Strategy defines the organization's distinctive approach. Strategy is about being different. So even though we may have cultural or linguistic or human sort of desire to be similar and to fit in and to conform, they're powerful forces that make people do the same thing, if you will. True strategy is about being different. And that's very difficult. So people can say, well, I have a strategy, I just want to be the best. That's not a strategy. I have a strategy that I want to do better than somebody else, but basically doing it harder or etc. That's if it's not a distinctive approach, it's not a strategy. So, and the competitive advantages of a company, its particular characteristics that support that distinctive approach. So this is the paradox of strategy. The paradox of strategy is what is best is actually what is different. So Tilingot, or different thing is bad thing, is actually, when it comes to really good strategy, is actually the opposite. Tilingot is not a bad thing. And what is good is not necessarily what everybody else is liking. In other words, one has to be able to connect with the market and understand the market, but at the same rate, for effective strategy, to actually be doing something different. This is the paradox of strategy. What is best is actually what is different. So we have 5 different market differentiation strategies. So differentiation, or doing something different, is very critical. It may be difficult to read on the screen, but you have the PDF available, upload it. One strategy is technology differentiation. Many Korean companies, obviously, were very high tech, differentiate on the basis of technology, and that's very important. And many university or science-based businesses, which is also quite strong in Korea, will differentiate on the basis of technology. The second market differentiation strategy is price and quality differentiation. And this is also a very important way that Korean businesses effectively compete in a global market, lower price. But interestingly, as you know, Chinese businesses have been able to get even lower prices. So that type of differentiation strategy has its limits, and we'll talk about the reasons why. So just competing on price can be very challenging. Product differentiation, having the same technology, same price, but a different product. So for example, the iPod, as compared to the original MP3 players, had certain design characteristics, so the product was different. The form factor was different, etc. Customer service differentiation. So that's a very important differentiator. When I'm in Korea, I like to use a Korean product often, because they have a very strong culture of after service for the Korean products. If you buy an imported product, it becomes more difficult. There are fewer after service. It may be more expensive. It may require some time period. So that kind of customer service differentiation is very important. So one time I bought a Samsung product in the United States, but it wasn't supported by customer service. I paid a lower price in America. The customer service differentiation, which is very important to me as a customer, wasn't there. So customer service differentiation. And the highest level of market differentiation that achieves the highest level of market penetration is the user experience differentiation. So this is very important in terms of how the product is used, how the person feels about the product, and that experience using the product or the service becomes very important. And as we'll learn extensively in this course in marketing, it's not just the product capability or service capability, it's also the experience and emotional aspect that becomes very important in differentiation. So 5 fundamental market differentiation strategies are technology differentiation, price and quality differentiation, product differentiation, customer service differentiation, and user experience differentiation. So this is very interesting. One can say strategy is everything. It's a plan or whatever, but actually strategy is quite limited in what it is. In other words, let's consider what strategy is not. So for example, strategy is not the same as aspirations. A strategy to be number 1 or number 2 is not a strategy. That's an aspiration. That may be a vision. Our strategy is to be the world leader. That is not a strategy. That is, again, an aspiration. Our strategy is just to grow. Well, every business has to grow, and that's just a given. So that is not the same as a strategy. That is an aspiration. Our strategy is to provide superior returns on investment to our shareholders and so forth. Again, that's not a strategy. That's just a fundamental precept of business. And then also a strategy is more than a particular action. So just merging with another company, or to become global, or to consolidate an industry, or to outsourcing strategy, or to simply double the R&D budget, or to introduce one product every year. Specific actions are also not strategies. They may be components of a strategy, but that is not a strategy. And then in relation to the aspirational aspect, the strategy is not the same as vision and values. So for example, our strategy is to advance technology for mankind, or our strategy is to be a good company, or to be ethical, or to serve humankind, or to do good in this world, whatever. These are certain vision and values, which is not the same as a strategy. So it's very important to note that this is not a strategy either. In particular, this concept is about differentiation, as we'll describe in more detail. So a strategy is not about goals. And as some of you may know, I worked at Samsung, and I had talked with a leading executive. This is a while ago. You know, what is the strategy for HME? HME is health and medical, and they said our strategy is to be number 1. But that's not a strategy, as I mentioned. And it's not about actions. This is a very interesting outsourcing mania. McKinsey, a major consultancy, has been driving a lot of outsourcing to increase efficiencies, to do just-in-time sourcing, and so forth. That improves technical efficiency, but is not a strategy. In fact, one can argue that it was a very bad strategy, or a very bad action, I should say, because in this realm of COVID-19 and the epidemic, the very tight supply chains and the highly outsourced aspect of that has led to significant problems. So I think for the future, strategies will also be about resilience and not just efficiency. Another example of particular actions was the whole realm of pharmaceutical mergers. where companies would merge. More pharmaceutical drug companies would do more and more mergers, and Pfizer in particular became the largest pharmaceutical company by merging and acquiring other companies and so forth. But that makes it a problem for creating new innovation, new internal differentiation. And so we see the effect of that with a lack of antivirals and vaccines and so forth. You don't achieve these long-term differentiated goals through just mergers. It's not about vision and values. And you might say these sound like strategies, but the reason they can be confused with strategies is that operational effectiveness, doing things better so that, for example, you can be number one, you can grow, you can outsource and so forth. Operational effectiveness, doing things better, uh, doing best practices, that's not a bad thing. It's always good to be effective. It's always good to follow best practices. It's always good to do things better. But that is not a distinct strategy because, in fact, everybody is trying to do better. Everybody is trying to do the best practices. There may be challenges to that. There may be obstacles to doing those best practices. People may not know all the best practices, but around the world, for example, Korea is doing a best practice in dealing with this epidemic, and many people are learning from that, and that's a good thing, so that all countries can do the testing, can do the contact tracing, can do the focused isolation, and the quarantines and so forth that are controlling this epidemic better in Korea than in other countries. These are best practices. We call that operational effectiveness. But this is not a strategy. Everybody's doing this, and they should be doing this. So a strategy is about being different. Pilingot in Korean, the different thing, which is not the bad thing, actually. The different thing can be the good thing. So strategic positioning, which is different than operational effectiveness, is creating a unique value proposition, doing things differently to deliver superior value. In other words, this is very much related to fundamental economic theory. How does a company create a profit? How does an organization deliver an extra value? If it's doing the same as everybody else, it is not going to be delivering that extra value. It will be at equilibrium. So strategy to deliver that value requires doing something different. So most of all, strategy is not operational effectiveness. And that goes for marketing strategy as well. Just doing the marketing better is not necessary, or following what everyone else is doing is not necessarily going to be the best unique strategy. So the perfect example is the Japanese challenge of the 1980s. So in the 1980s, 1970s and 1980s, many business books were talking about the Japanese strategy and the Japanese management methods, and that they were going to rule the world and be the Toyotas, the Sonys, the Mitsubishis. They were going to be the leading companies and wipe out, all the American companies and European companies, etc. That has not come to play, because fundamentally the strategy of the Japanese companies was actually one of operational effectiveness. It was a short-term strategy that did indeed create a lot of challenge in the 1980s for companies that were not doing operational effectiveness. But ultimately, this was not sustainable. The Koreans, in particular, also achieved that operational effectiveness and surpassed it. Other companies around the world followed that Japanese model, met it, and exceeded it. So the Japanese companies did not have a sustained strategy for strategic positioning that was distinct. It was a strategy of operational effectiveness. And so this is not a sustainable, distinct difference. We look at other companies that have sustainable, distinct differences based on strategy, and we'll discuss those. Any questions so far? So Dan Nan Yang said the strategy is shaped by the overall business goal. Yes, so strategy is not the same as the business goal, but what the strategy involves also that goal. A strategy, very interesting question, has to be, this distinct approach has to be aligned with two things. One is, of course, the goals and the aspirations. You want to get a strategy to achieve those goals. So maybe the phrase shaped is more precise, is partly shaped, I should say. But another big influence on the strategy is the business capabilities or competitive advantage. Do you have very good people? Do you have good technology? Do you have good designers? Do you have a culture of good customer service? Can you build on that plus your goals and shape this distinct strategy? So when we talk about operational effectiveness, we should talk about the productivity frontier. So the productivity frontier, which highlights this concept of the distinction between operational effectiveness versus strategic positioning. We look at the value on the vertical axis and the cost on the horizontal axis. So if the cost is low, the value may be lower. The cost is high, the value may be higher, roughly speaking. And this is the productivity frontier of the maximum value at a given cost that can be delivered. So obviously, if you are down here, in other words, providing low value at the moderate cost, for example, and other companies are here providing higher value at the same cost, you are not as operationally effective. And operational excellence moves to this productivity frontier. So all of these companies are in this region here, in the lower left-hand region of this framework of cost versus value, and they start to move this productivity frontier. So if you may come to this productivity frontier, other companies will come to this productivity frontier, delivering the same value at the same cost, and also moving the curve outwards results in absolute improvement, but no relative improvement. The result will be persistently low profits for a company if they don't have a distinctive strategy, because everybody will be doing the same. So that's what I mentioned about all the chicken and beer shops in Korea. They have very low margins. Many small and middle-sized businesses also in Korea have small margins. There are structural, strategic reasons for that. It's very difficult to do something different. Instead, you have to fit into a certain framework of a productivity frontier, and that limits the extra value you can provide. So, very interesting concept. And I mention this because the Korean businesses, we have had over the past decade or so challenges around business competitiveness and global competitiveness. And the key issue is in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 80s and 90s, many Korean businesses were following the Japanese model and exceeding the Japanese model in terms of operational effectiveness. But many companies have reach that in the global marketplace. There's been a lot of operational effectiveness achieved, and this has been done through benchmarking. So we want to do a product, and the first thing that people do is benchmarking. So we see what another company is doing, and we just do it a little bit better. But this will lead to convergence, because guess what? The other company is also going to benchmark, and they will then do the same, and that productivity frontier results in an equilibrium for everybody. So this is a zero-sum competition, in which a market with zero-sum competition is characterized by static or declining prices. We've seen that in the case in Korea and many businesses here. Pressure on costs, compromising long-term investment. So many small and medium-sized enterprises in Korea have this challenge, not being able to, because the margins are low, do a longer-term investment. So why is strategy important in general? So this is we're setting the framework for strategy and then relate to marketing strategy. So strategy is important to understand the industry and the company in that industry, understanding the core strengths, identifying strengths and weaknesses. We'll talk about the particular strategy framework and how to allocate resources to achieve that strategy. Strategy also involves adapting to a changing world, understanding these external factors that can affect the company, guiding sustainable activities and consistent activities in this changing environment. So change is very important in strategy, and vision and direction for the whole organization. And this is a big problem in many Korean companies. Like the Japanese ones before, they often do not have a real strategy. They have an operational effectiveness approach. And then you get pressure from Chinese companies or Vietnamese companies or Indonesian companies or whatever. So if you have an operational effectiveness strategy, that will have a limit. And so the Japanese companies have experienced this since the early 1990s, and Korean companies are experiencing this now. So I think it's a very important message that strategy is about being different. And of course, it's very important. So let's review some case studies again. A classic case study is the one between VHS and Betamax. These were the video recording standards, and of course the products that went with them. And the Betamax was the Sony product, and VHS was a Panasonic product that was licensed out. So the dark line here, the brown line here, is Betamax, and this is the market sales of VHS. And you can see that they obviously started out at zero, but VHS ultimately took over on the Betamax. So the Betamax strategy, this the differentiation, if you will, was it was only Sony, and it was based on the product quality. The VHS strategy was, in terms of placement, open licensing. So you see Maxell here, not just Panasonic, and a lower cost strategy. So these strategies are fundamentally marketing strategies. How do we penetrate the market? How do we get people to buy our product? What is our strategy to achieve that? And clearly the VHS strategy of having a more open system and at a lower cost that matched what consumers want was a better strategy. And how do we know which strategy is better? And this is very important about marketing strategy. Key aspect of marketing strategy is to understand the market. So there were other aspects of the market related to what types of shows people were recording, how long they were recording that, what quality that they were sufficiently satisfied with. Maybe the extra quality wasn't very important for somebody just recording a TV show and coming back to see it for one time or two times, whatever. So understanding the market is very critical for marketing strategy. Now we're going to go into some strategy frameworks. Any questions so far? How can we, the strategy frameworks is how we can establish some form of differentiation. How can we start to frame strategic questions? Any questions from the students? Okay, let's continue. So strategy frameworks. First one is a 2x2 matrix. We'll talk about an overview of business strategy. We'll discuss another framework called Ansough's opportunity matrix. We'll discuss the Boston Consulting Group, BCG model. We'll talk about SWOT analysis, and we'll talk about competitive advantage. Actually, before we do that, since it's 9:52, let's take a break here and let's continue at 5 minutes after 10. Let's continue at 5 minutes after 10, and we'll continue with strategy frameworks. We will start again at 10:05. So we have a short break here. Is that okay? Everybody fine? Great. So I'll see you at 10:05.